Steve Elkins. Welcome to Techtonic.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you on the show. I really enjoyed watching your new documentary called Echoes of the Invisible. This is a film that, as the film site puts it, is a mosaic of profound quests. You focus on four main people. There are other subjects, but there are four main subjects who you follow as they talk about or demonstrate various quests and journeys that they're on or have been on. You have a blind runner named Arnold, a journalist and I would say a long-range walker named Paul Salopek. You have a photographer named Rachel Sussman, and a cast of scientists, astronomers, physicists, including Anil and Anthaswamy, who are looking out through the galaxy and looking in through subatomic particles. And with this cast of characters, you take us all across the world through time and space. I would say a lot of things about this film, but straightforward is not a word I would use. But it's not chaotic or sprawling or flabby or anything. It's a series of journeys and resonances that interconnect. And where do we start with this, Steve?
Well, first of all, actually, just if I can comment on what you were saying about how it's not straightforward at all, that was something that was very deliberate. And it wasn't to be esoteric or anything like that. But it was because I do think that documentaries tend to lead us down a very preordained path in how we experience stories. And I kind of want to put the audience through the process of working their own way through the labyrinth of these people's lives, just like we all actually have to do in real life with our own lives. This was reflected back to me in an interesting way when I talked with theoretical physicist Lisa Randall when I filmed at CERN's Large Hadron Collider. And she's written about this in some of her books. She talks about how linear paths are actually kind of a dangerous thing for us as people. And science doesn't work that way. We think of science like as this linear path towards the truth or something, but that's not how science works at all. It's jagged, it's swerving, it's doing 180s out of nowhere. It's suddenly believing the opposite of everything you believed to be true a year ago. And things come together in bits and pieces. It's not like a continuous through line to get to your answers. And so if people are really fixated on having a linear path, then when things don't work out, they perceive it as a dead end, when in fact that dead end is valuable because you learned something. And this is actually how we live. This is how we shape our lives and our thoughts and our understanding of the world. So it's actually really valuable to appreciate that process of nonlinearity. Dead ends are not a negative thing. They're a positive thing in the long run. It's all about reshifting your perspective. So I like the audience to go through that in my films.
Yeah, you invite us into a fairly unique experience for a documentary film. As you say, a lot of documentaries that work well, they take you from point A to point B. Maybe there's a little twist at the end, but it's fairly linear. And what you're doing here in Echoes of the Invisible is it really is, to use the cliche, the journey is the reward. Going through these twisting paths and seeing things from different perspectives and timescales is worthwhile in itself. Maybe we could start with one of the stories to illuminate for the listeners what we're talking about. Maybe we could start with Arnold. I had never heard of this runner, again, long-distance runner who was legally blind. I think Mr. Arnold is no longer with us. Is that right?
That's right. He passed away, I believe, in 2017, and unfortunately, he never got to see the film.
His story was really intriguing. This is a guy, as I said, who was legally blind, got into long, and I mean long, distance running, and decided that running more than a marathon in a day was not difficult enough. And so he decided to run from Death Valley, in fact, maybe the hottest point in Death Valley, which is a place called the Badwater Basin, lowest point of altitude in the Western Hemisphere, I believe, to go from Badwater Basin, the salt flat, that's just baking, and run, I think it was 150 miles to Mount Whitney, and to do it all in one go by himself. Well, there's a side story about him trying to do it with a partner, but he wanted to do all of this in the dead of summer. So it was Can you explain, Steve, why Al was taken with this idea of this incredibly difficult long-distance run and what some of the failures were along the way, as you were saying before, about dead ends and the learnings you got from it? In short, why did you want to include Al Arnold's story in this film?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the dead ends part. You're absolutely right. That fits in perfectly with what I was just saying before, because Al almost died the first several times that he attempted to run across Death Valley.
The first several times. So I'm sorry to interrupt. He decides to run 150 miles in the summer starting from Death Valley, and he almost dies. And his response is, well, I have to try that again.
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes the training period in between the different attempts was literally several years. It wasn't just like, oh, I'll go back and retrain for another month or two and try it again. No, it was, I mean, he was trying on and off for the better part of that entire decade, which was the 1970s. Yeah. Each time he tried and almost died, he learned something very valuable that enabled him to accomplish what he did accomplish later. And so that really fits perfectly into how that notion that Lisa Randall, the theoretical physicist, was talking about dead ends really applies to athletes as well. And I think it applies to people from all walks of life as represented in the film, whether they're artists or monks or journalists. They're all kind of treating their circumstances this way. That's the perspective they take on their work. But this question of like, why would Al do this was burning in my mind when I interviewed him. And both that question and his answer kind of reveals some of the central reasons I made this film. So it may seem like all these journeys are unconnected on the surface, but they're actually connected by a whole labyrinth of underlying themes. One of them is that I am interested in people who are so committed to going into these incredibly extreme environments, literally the most extreme environments on Earth, for whatever line of work they're doing, whether they're, again, athletes, scientists, monks, artists, journalists. There's something about the human spirit or about human nature. There's something in us that often drives us into extreme circumstances. So I kind of wanted to put a microscope on that aspect of human nature. Another thing that kind of connects all these people is that by going into these extreme environments, they end up able to see something that was previously invisible to them. So when I asked Al, like, what was the ultimate reason you did this? Like, why were you really driven to do this? His answer fascinated me. He could have very well said, oh, well, I'm an athlete, so I wanted to put this athletic notch under my belt, or I wanted to impress my friends, or I just want to feel like I accomplished something, whatever. That was not his answer. His answer was, I did this because I'm almost entirely blind. And most people get their sense of orientation in life through sight. We are a very sight-centric species. And I couldn't rely on sight to figure out how to shape my life or to understand life. I had to go further and further inward. And not having that sense allowed me to go further and further inward. So it was a way of trying to see in the dark, basically. And he could only see certain things in the dark by pushing himself to such extremes and such insane circumstances. And he actually did it. He wanted to know who he really was, in a way.
There certainly is a feel throughout this film that I got that all of these stories have a spiritual component. Whatever your definition or perception of that term is, spiritual. But as you say, Al Arnold was trying to see by taking an internal journey. I felt like you've set it up nicely. You set the expectations well. With the very first shot in the film, there's a Tuareg proverb that you quote from the Sahara Desert, which is, there are lands that are full of water for the well-being of the body, and there are lands that are full of sand for the well-being of the soul. This idea of the soul or the spirit, the spiritual reality that we inhabit as people and what we want to do with that is a recurring theme, as is the desert. I'll add, you start with a shot of the Saharan sand dunes, and then we go later to the very large telescope in the Atacama Desert in South America, and then the Chihuahuan Desert in West Texas. And there may have been others, but those are the ones that I noted in my notes. And you make explicit reference to the desert fathers and mothers who were the early monkish Christian leaders who lived in the desert in Egypt and other places. And you even have some footage of monks who still live in the caves alone in silence for years.
Yeah, it's incredible because in Ethiopia, I found these monks who have been living a version of Christianity, a particular culture of Christianity that remains unchanged and unbroken virtually since its beginnings. It's actually one of the oldest types of Christianity on earth, which is Ethiopian Orthodox. It dates back, I believe, to the 2nd century AD. So, that basically takes us almost back to the actual time of Christ. So if we want to kind of look back in time, which is another theme of the film, looking as far back in time as you really can through the lives of these monks because they're living the same way they did almost 2,000 years ago, living in these caves in silence.
So you have the spiritual journey in the desert, in silence. These are all themes that come up in your interconnected stories. And then you have this theme of timescales, which is also throughout this film, which I thought you wove in masterfully throughout these stories. The principal subject who I think best embodies the timescales is the photographer named Rachel Sussman. Now, I should note that I know Rachel from way back, and so we're friends. So I was really happy to encounter her story. Rachel Sussman is a photographer. Her first major project was called The Oldest Living Things in the World, where she went around the world photographing living things, trees and slime molds and, I don't know, a huge range of life. But the living organisms had to be more than 2,000 years old. And she's gone on to more galactic work since then, I guess we could say. But she's someone who has been concerned with long expanses of time. And through her work investigating these living things and photographing them, she has drawn out some lessons that we can learn from the longevity of these things. What were some of the things that you learned from Rachel, Steve, as you got to know her and her work?
Many things, but one of the most important was that the oldest living things on Earth survive in the most extreme environments on Earth, the same places where everyone else in my film was gravitating towards. And they didn't survive in spite of these extreme environments, but specifically because of them. Generally speaking, they had to learn how to slow down, which in the film is sometimes equated with silence or synonymous in some ways with silence. That basically allowed them to live for thousands of years, anywhere from 2,000 to even 500,000 years, depending on which species we're talking about. And I think there's some amazing metaphors in that for us to think about with our own lives, because our culture is so, workaholic and efficiency centric. That has its value, but we do not prize very much about slowing down.
No, slowing down and being silent are antithetical to our dominant culture, which is led by the values of Silicon Valley and the big tech companies that increasingly run the economy. I mean, if you think about move fast and break things, that is exactly the opposite of what Rachel Sussman is revealing to us is the secret of longevity and really of life.
Yeah.
Be quiet and grow slowly. That's not a very good pitch if you want to get $10 million for your next startup.
Yeah. And, there's something else I learned from Rachel that I really wanted to put into the film, and it was something I cut out just due to time. I learned that there were trees she photographed that I believe were in Australia that originally were in Antarctica. I didn't realize that trees migrate. They basically migrated during an earlier period of time when those lands were probably connected before the continents separated. But they basically were moving further north to get to a warmer climate as things got colder in what's now Antarctica. I really wanted to put that in there because the film is about all these people making pilgrimages. And the idea that trees, are kind of literally making their own pilgrimage, it's just at a rate that's so slow. It's over thousands of years that we don't perceive it visually with our eyes. It was something that I wanted to use to connect ourselves with nature thematically in the film.
It's both reassuring that life has, in these trees and these organisms, has predated much of human history, but it's also worrying that as our society speeds up, and things get more efficient, as we're promised from Silicon Valley, that what we're speeding up is our deadly effects on the environment. And of course, this raises the specter of climate change, which seems to be operating on a scale much, much faster than the slow-growing life forms that Sussman is dealing with.
Right. And that's something that Rachel learned in the film. She talks about how just because something is so incredibly old does not mean that it's immortal. And it's very striking that so many of the living beings that she photographed wound up dying within the actual 10-year window of time in which she was photographing them, even though they had been alive for 2,000 years or longer. I mean, that tells you a lot about the nature of the time we're living in right now. If within a 10-year window of time, multiple of these living beings perished, whether because of human negligence or because of ulterior motives or the speed of our lives or any other things, like, for example, there was the underground forest in South Africa that was basically paved over to change the traffic signals out, in the area where they were when they could have just as well gone around it. That says a lot about the times we're living in, that so many of them would die in the same window of time.
I want to talk about Paul Salopek and his walk. This is a story that I had heard a little bit about when he started a couple of years ago. I saw a headline that there was a guy who wanted to walk across the earth following the original migratory path of humans out of East Africa, where humans first left the savannah and into Asia and all the way across and over and down to South America. Tierra del Fuego, I think, is the point on Earth where humans most recently arrived. Paul's journey is funded by National Geographic, and he expected to have it done within 7 or 8 years. But when he started out, I just thought to myself, this guy's crazy. This must be a joke or a gimmick or something. No, you can't walk from East Africa all the way through Asia, up into Alaska, and then all the way down. He's never going to make it. I mean, what does he even think he's doing? And so it was nice. It's nice to have my cynicism corrected by your film, Steve, because it's a cliche, but it is really one of the most inspirational through lines of the film, because Paul is really doing it, and he's doing it for the right reasons, and he's doing it the right way. He really is walking, and he's somewhere in South Asia now. But your footage shows Paul walking through parts of Africa and into the Middle East, and he has some amazing experiences and lessons and revelations to share with us as he looks at the world at walking speed, as he puts it, at 3 miles an hour.
Yeah, and one of those revelations is that, since you were talking about how insane it struck you when you heard he was doing this, one of his revelations is that this is actually utterly normal, what he's doing. Not necessarily that one human being would walk across the world within their lifetime, but the pace at which he's walking day to day is actually how our species was built to walk. In the film, he talks about how scientists have now put GPS trackers on the last remaining hunter-gatherers, like traditional hunter-gatherers left on Earth, which I believe are in Tanzania. They found that they walk an average of 7 miles a day. That's just casual walking to do what they have to do each day. At that rate, you're basically walking from New York to Los Angeles annually. He broke it down, and that's essentially the exact rate at which he's walking across the earth right now. So one of his revelations from this is that this is actually normal, and our bodies are built for this. It's not extreme sports or anything like that. And in fact, it's sitting down, as our culture tends to gravitate towards. Like it's sitting down that's actually so crazy.
And we're saying this as we're both sitting down looking at screens.
Exactly. Yeah. So, this is another example of someone in the film seeing something that was previously invisible by going into an extreme environment or an extreme experience. Most of us, when we hear about what he's doing, would have the same reaction you initially did, which is, what an extreme guy, how crazy. And in fact, He discovered we're literally built for this. It's not normal that we're not doing this.
Yeah, he says what is invisible to most of us is that the extreme lifestyle is sitting down all day and looking at a screen.
Yeah.
That's extreme in a bad way for human physiology, psychology, everything else.
Right. And doing these kinds of long-term pilgrimages, walking so many miles each day, it's not just about what our bodies are physically built to do. It taps into other aspects of human nature, such as how we form relationships with each other. This is something that I think is increasingly invisible to us as well. The less we do it, the less we walk through life in the way that Paul is right now. Because through most of our species history, we have formed relationships at literally walking pace. And you do interact with people differently. I've done this myself because I've actually walked across 2 countries. And you form relationships completely differently. Your inner picture of what the world is like is completely different. You do, of course, have to anticipate certain inevitable dangers, but generally speaking, the world, you realize, is a much, much safer and less hostile place than you think when you're meeting people at walking pace and not, for example, hearing about them on the news while you're in the bubble of your car or whatever. So these are other aspects of what it means to be alive and what it means to be human that are becoming increasingly invisible the less we go through these extreme experiences and environments.
Yeah, I think that's a really important lesson, and your film does us a service, Steve, by highlighting this and telling Paul's story and the others, because just like some of the old organisms that Rachel was photographing that have died in our new accelerating age, we're losing all sorts of cultural memory and possibilities of connection with each other as we, hurtle into this a society full of screens and surveillance and motorized transport. It was interesting that Paul says in the film that he was astonished at the level of hospitality that he received along the way. He makes a comment about Abrahamic religions because he was going from Africa through the Middle East. He said he encountered Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and without exception, each of those cultures was overflowing with hospitality. And he said, I haven't yet gotten to the Buddhist and Hindu and so on, the Eastern religions, but I expect I'll find the same there. His point wasn't so much about the religions, I think, but that the only difficulties he seemed to face was in places where there were repressive political regimes, when there was pressure from the top, from police or authoritarian leaders, then people would shut down, even if he could tell they felt bad, they couldn't be as hospitable. That was one, the repressive environment. And the other is in societies that had fully given themselves over to new technology, such as cars and highways. There was a section of the film where you have some footage from Saudi Arabia. This was Paul walking through.
Yeah.
And he's talking about memory, which is another theme in the film. And he's saying essentially that Saudi Arabia, modern Saudi Arabia, has lost a lot of its memory, its historical memory, cultural memory, as it has adopted motorized transport, highways, a lot of the things that you see in the U.S., and has left its traditional modes behind in a lot of ways. He points out that Saudi Arabia now is even more urban than the United States because of the oil wealth. Talk to me about the theme of memory in this film.
Yeah, that's a pretty deep topic. One of the literal things that Paul discovered in that scene you're talking about is that when he was on foot trying to make his way across Saudi Arabia, he really couldn't ask anyone for directions if they got lost. And first of all, they shouldn't have been getting lost at all because the traditional Hajj trail system, which crosses Saudi Arabia to get to Mecca, those were sacred walkways for a good chunk of human history. And no one knew how to get to them anymore on the original trails. They only knew how to get to them by car on the freeway. So first of all, the Hajj trail system was slowly starting to disappear, or become kind of blurred into the landscape because it wasn't so traversed. We tend to know a lot less about our history, about our culture, when we live in such conveniences like cars and air-conditioned buildings, and don't put ourselves through the extremes that the people in the film are putting themselves through.
You've got a quote from Linda Lynch, who's a friend of Paul Salopek. She's the painter who lives in the Chihuahuan Desert in West Texas. And you show her creating some of these beautiful paintings, abstract and really striking. And she talks a little bit about what she calls deep memory. She says, something is being accessed that I can't know consciously, and yet it's there. And I don't dictate ahead of time what the drawing is to be. I do feel that the grasses have memory, the soil has memory, The air has memory, the memory of water. This, again, is another echo of something invisible. Here you have an accomplished artist telling you in some pretty intense language that she actually is accessing something that's totally beyond our rational understanding, and yet it's there.
Yeah. All the people in the film are trying to see something that previously was invisible to them, whether it's in the landscape, in the cosmos, in the microscopic realm, whatever it may be, even about the human body. And in her case, it's kind of going deeper into her own unconscious and the process of making art in a state of stillness and silence, which she deliberately practices when she does this, when she doesn't try to fill her process with the noise of her own thoughts. It almost comes back to Lao Tzu. You know, the first line of the Tao says something like, "Whatever can be named is not it." I'm paraphrasing, but essentially the idea that our language only grasps reality so much, and probably incorrectly on some level. So there are aspects of our lives, aspects of our experience, aspects of what it means to be human that we can't distinctly put words to. And so I really appreciate in her and other artists I admire, they're actually trying to unveil something that's ultimately a mystery.
And this, again, I think is totally true and totally antithetical to the values that are being imposed on us from the technocrats in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, telling us that everything can be reduced to an algorithm, everything can be measured, everything can be fit into binary blocks of zeros and ones, everything can be known. What all of your subjects in this film, Echoes of the Invisible, are telling us is there's so much more. That is such an impoverished worldview that we can know and control everything through digital technology. There's so much more to life, and not just human life, not a human-centered worldview, just life and existence in any state is so much bigger and broader and deeper and more profound than what a smartphone app can deliver to us.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, because life is not entirely about what can be measured. It's, I think, a good thing about human nature that we're seekers and we try to understand things and we try to roll back the curtain and perceive and understand what we don't. That's a beautiful thing. But I think that if you're reducing reality to what can be measured, you're only looking at a tiny little fragment of life. I mean, there are so many examples of this. St. Augustine has this famous phrase, "The measure of love is to love without measure." You know, there are so many aspects of life that can't be contained within our rational minds and within what we can measure, you know, which is why science is, for example, yes, very important, but it's not everything. It's not the totality of truth either. It's also a very narrow window through which to perceive things.
Well, I feel like we could continue discussing these themes, but I want to encourage listeners to go and watch your film for themselves. It's called Echoes of the Invisible. They can find it on Apple TV. Also, if you're a Canopy subscriber, it's on Canopy. That's free for subscribers. And check your local public library. A number of public libraries in the U.S. offer cardholders free access to Canopy. And how can people keep in touch with you, Steve, so we can learn about your next project when it comes around?
I'm archiving a lot of my work on my website, which is steveelkins.net. I actually have not updated that site in about 7 or 8 years, but I'm just flooding it with all kinds of stuff from my previous work and previews of my upcoming work.
Well, if any of them have anything of the resonance that Echoes of the Invisible did, I hope you'll be back on Techtonic to talk about your future work. Steve Elkins, great chatting with you. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.